So today's interview, I'm at EDINA with Nicola Osborne, who's agreed to tell us about her work in the field of citizen science and crowdsourcing.
Okay. So yes, like I said, I'm Nicola Osborne. I'm based in EDINA. So EDINA run lots of online services for further and higher education, but also lots of research projects as well. So at the moment I'm digital education manager and managing a multimedia service, but I have been working on a project called COBWEB, which is a huge 4-year project with 13 different partners involved across Europe, looking at how we can use citizens to be part of the kind of data collection and engagement process in environmental science. So that's my main focus of citizen science type activity has been on that.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that, how that project was kind of developed and what it focused on?
So it brings together kind of expertise from both kind of technical and environmental fields as well. So the project itself is building this sort of generic set of tools to be used in crowdsourcing. So from mobile phones that are very kind of simple and user-friendly and designed for being out in a flood or being out in environment, through to kind of quality checking stages, authentication stages, and into a kind of web portal as well. So the idea is that there'd be a lot of different projects all enabled with the same set of tools. And to make that actually get built, you can need some examples. So there are also a whole series of co-design projects. So the project has partners from 5 different countries, but projects in 3 different locations. So in UNESCO biospheres in Wales, Germany and Greece. And they're currently doing co-design projects in those 3 locations. Yeah, so a whole bunch of interesting additional challenges. So in addition to all the things you would normally get with citizen science projects, so like verification of data, managing data from lots of different people and how they kind of choose to tag and mark it up and all those kind of things. But there's also some language elements. There's the issue of how we structure things so that it works for different types of projects, but without having to design a completely new tool every time. So it's been a really interesting project for raising all kinds of issues, sort of social issues and cultural issues, as well as technical ones as well.
And was this project necessary because a lot of these elements weren't there already?
Generally speaking, when there are citizen science projects kicked off, they tend to be very much, here is an app built for this one project, or here is a tool built for this one project. And so it felt that there was definitely a gap there for something that was more generic that could be reused. Some of the kind of key elements that are different about our project is that it's designed to fit into some existing standards around geographical data. So the data that is produced through this process is INSPIRE compliant and inspires the directive within the EU for environmental data of some very specific types to be made publicly available. So there's a kind of publication format for that. And for the same reason it links into GEOS, which is a sort of portal that lets you access INSPIRE compliant data. So there's some kind of very specific kind of gaps it was filling from that point of view, from sort of an obligation for governments in different locations to make that.
So it can almost go straight to open data?
Yes, pretty much, although again one of the kind of levels of complexity is making sure that we're not releasing anything that it's not appropriate to release. So in addition to kind of quality, that's also about if someone is collecting endangered species data, that's not going to be published. So part of the project is also about scoping which kinds of data one shares and which kind of data one can't share. And the INSPIRE directive is also fairly sensible about that. They don't expect you to share things that are not appropriate to share. So the gaps it was filling, I guess, were both for not requiring every single project that wants to start up to need to set up their own tools and build their own tools, but also from a very kind of specific government point of view and sort of public policy kind of point of view, having tools that fit the expected, not really file formats, but kind of method by which that data is supposed to be shared. So the Welsh Government is actually one of the 13 partners in the project who have been helping keep us on track in the kind of governmental requirements kind of point of view. Yes.
Yeah. So how long before that's going to be something coming out of this?
The co-design projects have functioning prototypes at the moment, so there is a version that you can go out and use. I think I have a version on my phone actually. So I was with the project until February, and in February I switched job hats, so my colleagues are currently working on it. I believe the pilots and the co-design stuff is going on at the moment, so it's being tested in the field. The mobile apps in particular, but actually other elements of the interfaces have been developed with people in the communities we want to take part, so that they work for them. And because of that, it's a slightly longer process. So those pilots are really helping us highlight what it is their needs are, if the forms make sense, if the data makes sense, if the process makes sense.
So by communities, you mean the professionals working, or?
It's sort of community groups and organisations who are organising little, small-scale crowdsourcing projects in the locations within those biospheres. So the coastline projects I know best are the ones in Wales, but there are a series in Greece as well. And the ones down there are organised by people like the RSPB, by Cardigan Bay Marine Wildlife Group, I think, used to focus on megafauna. Snowdonia National Park, the local secondary school is involved. So they're quite different types of communities. There are some volunteer kind of neighbourhood communities, but also, you know, the RSPB, Outward Bound, people like that, very much more structured organisations. They have very different needs. And that's one of the more interesting things about testing it with a genuinely diverse community of users. You know, the people who are using it might be used to submitting environmental data in some kind of format, and they might be completely new to it. And actually, the idea of the thing that we're building has been to make it flexible enough to gather both types of data, so stuff that is much easier for a novice user to go through, but also accommodating of non-novice users, you know, relatively expert volunteers or paid people. It might well be paid people using the same tool.
So is it focused around data collection, or is there another layer to it?
There's data collection, there's quality assurance, there's a whole work package looking at quality assurance and a whole work package looking at authentication. So the idea being that if you want to make sure that only a restricted set of people can take part in an experiment, then there is a way of authenticating those people and a way of doing that in a quite sort of seamless, sensible way. So we use Shibboleth, which is the same thing that is used in the UK Access Management Federation. So if you've ever logged into a sort of online resource, that's often what you're logging in with. So it's very secure, but it also allows you to be quite clever about who you share data with, and that's particularly with things like endangered species and sort of data that you'd want to limit access in mind, but also things like, you know, if you had government wardens, for instance, kind of gathering data and wanting to use it for very specific purposes and they didn't want to publish it, that might be a route to doing that. That's the idea that you can restrict data collection and data access to a set of people. So the quality assurance side of it has been also quite an interesting, complicated thing, because different organisations require quality assurance in a completely different set of ways. So there's a community forum that are doing work around their housing. They're probably not going to be as bothered about the level of quality assurance, because they can probably go and check with somebody what it was they saw. You know, they're quite nearby what's going on. You know, the RSPB, Snowdonia National Park, bigger organisations, bigger audiences, they might want to have a certain amount of quality assurance to make sure that they understand what they've had in from lots of different people that they maybe haven't had direct contact with. Welsh Government's going to want a whole different level of quality assurance to make sure they can actually use that data in a meaningful way, especially if it's going alongside Earth observation data or sensor data, stuff that they know is reliable. As soon as you start combining less reliable data with reliable data, you can get into some interesting challenges. So you have to know, not necessarily that it's perfect, but you have to know what level of incorrect it is, or what level of reliable it is, so that you can judge it accordingly.
So quality is one of the key issues we're looking throughout these courses. What sort of mechanisms are that? Also crowdsourced quality control, or is it all done? Is it kind of some statistical methods, or is it by experts?
I mean, there are lots of different approaches you can take, and I know that there are places that will do it just based on number of identical submissions. Now that's something that Zooniverse do, so they show a lot of people the same images and they will look through and see which ones match up. That works very well if you're controlling what data people see or what data they're gathering. For our project, the likelihood is that your group of people will not all be seeing the same thing at the same moment. So it's much more about things like, are they located in the place they say they are, and what data can we gather from the phone when they've got the app on it to verify that. What can we do in terms of their consistency of previous submissions to sort of see if their current one is likely to be correct? Is there some way of, you know, assigning some people in the system a more trusted status than others? There's a whole set of different options, and certainly the way in which it's being done for our project brings together a whole set of those, so that you don't just have one level, but you can select which ones you use. So if you're needing a very high spec or very quality assured set of data, you can do that if you're doing it as a public engagement thing and you're not that bothered by the data you get out of it. It's all about getting people involved and trying out the scientific method. You can choose how much lightweight one that just sort of says, you know, take out the totally inappropriate photos. But I know, to be absolutely fair, the last point test of saw a quality assurance process in play, which was some months ago, it's a really nice set of different options that you could use, and some of those are about sort of data methods, so sort of seeing if it looks like it's likely to be correct in some statistical ways, and some of those were about very specific stuff, location checking and reliability checking. It's the combination of those, I think, which will make it...
Do you have any learning mechanisms built in to help people improve the quality of data that's being put in?
I think at present that would be very much about how stuff is presented within sort of apps and interfaces and information for a particular experiment. And there's certainly some guidance notes within the sort of apps. I know the sort of prototype apps had some guidance about sort of, you know, for instance, with flooding, how to do things safely, but also what it is they're looking for. Yeah. So there's an element of that. But I think there's probably scope to do potentially more with that. I don't know if that's something that is like, given that we're about 2 and a bit years into a 4-year project, I'm not sure what we'll end up with at the end in terms of that kind of stuff. But it would be nice to think that our citizens get more qualified the more they participate, and that's certainly what you see from other crowdsourcing and citizen science projects. You see participants getting really, really expert in some cases, you know, getting really involved. So I think there'll be an element of that in the actual tools that they're using, but I think it's more likely to also be around the person who is running that project, so the organisation or the individual who's running a smaller project using those tools.
Interesting. You've been working around people who've been doing this in different areas for the last few years. What's the state of this sort of citizen science crowdsourcing within science?
It's quite interesting because it's sort of it's not a new concept in some ways. So there's a really nice report done for the UK Earth Observation Framework, I think it is, that looked across crowdsourcing projects that have been going on for a while. And obviously things like the Great British Garden Bird Watch, I forget exactly its title, but the RSPB's running effectively a citizen science project for sort of 40, 50 years, but it wasn't labelled in that way. So there's quite a long tradition, especially in environmental science, for doing some kind of participatory experiment. And really, if you do kind of history of science, you know, science is always, there's always kind of a participatory thing. But in terms of the kind of more sophisticated stuff, web-enabled and app-enabled stuff, I think you've got some maturity from certain kinds of disciplines and areas. So environmentally, there's loads of different projects, and there's starting to be a kind of sense of techniques that work well or approaches that work well, which is why you've got stuff like this, you know, these reports that give a good overview of what's taking place. In astronomy, you know, Zooniverse or the player in town, they're doing a good job. In biology, you get things like Foldit about sort of identifying proteins. So there are a few kind of groupings where there's lots of things taking place, and there's a sort of growing understanding of how you might use this for data collection. And it's often, I think at the moment, the kind of main application of it's been around dealing with data at scale. There are smaller projects that tend to be about science communication, and there are bigger projects that tend to be about data at scale. And I'd say the kind of image recognition type stuff, the kind of Zooniverse stuff, the sort of cancer cell stuff, that stuff's quite mature. There's an easy, straightforward process to do that. There's a quality assurance process for doing that. I'd say the kind of stuff that COBWEB's been working on, the kind of environmental science, but where it's much more about monitoring in a sort of broader sort of sense. I think that's still maturing. It's not quite there yet, because there are so many different types of factors that can come in. There tend to be lots of different things taking place and knowledge being shared. There's a lot of stuff going on to share that knowledge at the moment, but it's not quite in that place where there's a sort of one clear approach. There's lots of interesting approaches. And you get sort of other little outlier things taking place. So you have some of the kind of there's some innovation kind of spaces where you can sort of crowdsource ideas, but there's still more commercial ideas, and there's a couple of different sort of models there. So I think it's semi-mature, I would guess.
Yes.
There are sort of the models are quite diverse. I think that's interesting because in some of the other places where crowdsourcing is used, there may be sort of more straightforward approaches being sort of taken. So a lot of digitised texts and books and things being sort of effectively typed back in by people. You know, that's quite a kind of classic citizen science, well, a crowdsourcing project in the kind of humanities, and that has a certain shape to it, and that sits in a different sort of place, I think. So I think it's becoming quite a useful tool, but I mean, one of the interesting things from the point of view of the stuff that we've been working on is that it's expensive to put sensors in every place you want to put it. In a rural area where you only have a legal obligation as a local government or as a conservation organisation to cover a small set of requirements, you know, either a small number of measurements or a small area or whatever. And so there are real opportunities for using crowdsourcing to kind of cover those gaps. But what's interesting about a rural location, and projects we've been involved with have been quite rural, is that there also aren't many people. So the idea of a crowd is an interesting challenge there. So you start to see why there have been a lot of like image recognition projects and a lot of things at scale more than sort of boots on the ground kind of projects in super rural locations. So OpenStreetMap is an interesting one. OpenStreetMap being sort of science, I guess, in this geographical stuff. They have brilliant coverage in OpenStreetMap volunteered for urban areas, and they have brilliant coverage in some other locations, but you get to kind of rural areas and it gets to be less strong. So there's this kind of odd dynamic where some of the gaps in the information are also the gaps in where the people are, and trying to work out how to... I think you need super keen people anyway for crowdsourcing projects, but the kind of, you know, your kind of break-even point of effort versus kind of reward is in a much more interesting place.
It gets certain distance, but it doesn't fill in you know, you can fill in quite a lot of holes, but not all around. A couple of things that I want to pick up on there. One is, you mentioned this is being used by local authorities and organisations that are obliged to collect certain data. Can you give me a couple of examples?
Okay, so in the case of the areas that COBWEB's operating in, the Welsh Government needs to look at things like flooding data and likelihood of flooding in an area, and they have sensors in some locations. They're obliged to kind of record those and report those, but putting them in all of the areas you would possibly want them to be in is just cost prohibitive. You couldn't possibly do it, and you couldn't justify putting in expensive sensors in sort of 12 locations because 2 houses might be affected. The people who live in those 2 houses, they're more than happy to collect the data because it really matters to them. So that would be kind of part of the example. I guess the other kind of sort of related area to that would be things like local authorities engaged in crowdsourcing projects where they haven't necessarily initiated them, the sort of fix my street type stuff, the sort of where sort of citizens are. I think at first they were just sort of tapping them on the shoulder and saying you need to do what you're expected to, you know. I think at this point it's sort of, the citizens are far better at mapping out where the need is anyway. So I know that Edinburgh Council has recently done a sort of crowdsourced how should we spend less money kind of budget tool, and I think that's quite an interesting development. I think that sort of direct democracy kind of idea appearing around the same sort of time with social media and crowdsourcing, it does mean you get a lot of kind of crossover of some of those ideas. But yeah, in terms of the obligations, it's about sort of reporting on sort of numbers of particular species as well. That's something that there's an obligation to do, sort of monitoring what's happening in your area and actually going back and check every year. And each of those things cost money, and each of those things require you to have a lot of people around, or to sample only a small area if you're not able to do lots of people. And that is most places where having even a few more volunteers can make quite a big difference to how much data you can capture.
And the second thing is the people who are the volunteers. What have you learned about why they do it?
It's a good question. I think people are motivated by really different things. So, although I've been involved in this project for about 2.5 years, I've been sort of interested and engaged with crowdsourcing in some form or another for a while before that. And what you find is motivations can be hugely wide-ranging. So some people do it because they're looking for something to fill a bit of time that is very different from what they're doing in their day job. So that's like the classic Zooniverse participant, your classic sort of transcriber of texts, you know, those kind of participants, they're often people who want to do that. I think for the environmental projects, the stuff that COBWEB's been working on, it's often about an interest in the environment and an interest in what the sort of meaning behind that data is. And that's quite interesting because a lot of those crowdsourcing projects, you're doing a thing that's quite mechanical, like folded proteins is like a video game almost, you know, you click on things and you don't necessarily understand the science behind it, and you could, but it'd be quite an effort to work out what's going on the screen. Whereas for kind of environmental data, even capturing one data point tells you something, you know. So I think quite a lot of people involved in those projects, it is about sort of environmental issues, environmental concerns, usually in a kind of conservation type direction, but sometimes from a point of view of, you know, things like planning and development, things like flooding and insurance. But there has to be some kind of motivating factor, otherwise they're just, you know, not going to stick with it. And there needs to be some kind of reward back again as well. In addition to my role here, I do some teaching on a science communication MSc. And one of the things that's quite important, but sometimes easy to forget, is that people do need to be rewarded for doing something. They're not going to come back and do it lots of times. So you have this kind of participation pattern in crowdsourcing projects where you have several super keen users, or a large quantity of super keen users, but it's a small percentage usually of your group of participants. And I think, depending on the project, but the kind of the magic bit to get right is how to motivate enough people to be in that group that you get enough of the data that you need to cover enough of the areas that you need. So you know, lots of different ways to do that, but I think often that's about communicating back the results of what's happened, especially in environmental projects. So the RSPB's one, for instance, they report every year on which garden birds have been spotted less or spotted more, and that's then a really interesting story to people who are interested in birds and will motivate them to go back and collect them again the next year. That's a nice example of a very cheap way of rewarding people for their participation. You know, Zooniverse gives co-credits on papers. For COBWEB, the projects are kind of pretty hyper-local, so I think the kind of motivation for our participants there is very much about either finding a more interesting way to do stuff they're going to do anyway. So in one case, you know, the Megafauna project, they do it on paper, currently, paper and or entering into databases elsewhere. So putting it all together in one place and doing it in a more straightforward way, that's going to save them some time. So there's a motivation for people taking part there because they're going to do it anyway and it saves them time and they're already interested. But for the sort of, I don't know, your school groups and things, you know, the motivation is it's got to be a bit fun, as well as being interesting and telling them something about the local environment. So it varies hugely, and depending on how you set that experience up, what's going to actually work in terms of motivations will vary as well, because there are some projects that I think how much science you understand in it isn't relevant at all, and there are some projects where it's much more relevant than the data that they collect. And that's all just to do with choices on the part of the person who set up that project to work out what it is they want to get out of it, what the goals are, and what a sort of success in that project will look like.
Have you seen any paid crowdsourcing in science?
I think most examples I've seen have been in sort of, they've been in that sort of transcribey, translation, political manifesto, someone do a kind of live political manifesto coding. I'm not aware of them, that doesn't mean that's not going on, but there are some crowdsourcing type tools that are used by a mixture of professionals and volunteers. So there are paid people engaged. I mean, not just people who are setting out the project perhaps, but sort of, we have a little app called Field Trip GB, and we know that's being used in a couple of forests, and people who are using that are a mixture of the paid staff that work in those forests and the unpaid volunteers that are committed to those areas and visitors. So there is that kind of mixture in that sense.
It's not really specifically people just being paid.
It's not people kind of going
to see a bird or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably not entirely unrelated to the fact that the kind of data being collected there, that might skew the results to some extent. Whereas the transcription stuff, you're not going to necessarily be concerned. You know, you can rate the quality, and if it's poor, you can choose to not pay them, and that's kind of how those usually work. But for something where you're not going to be there, you can't double check it, you can't verify it in any other way, I think there's a sort of, the trust in that data probably partly comes from the fact that they're unpaid, but there's a whole tension there because some of this work is stuff that maybe you would have paid a whole series of people to do previously. And I know that there is a kind of concern about exploitation of volunteers potentially. particularly because you do have the kind of superpowered volunteers. So I saw a project once explaining how half of their data had been entered by one person. Yeah. And you sort of thought, you should just be paying that one person. That does seem slightly exploitative. Now, she was enjoying doing it, the one person, because they'd spoken to her. Yeah. And I know that they'd, in that case, rewarded the participants by having them come in and have a sort of exclusive viewing of some of their collections and meeting them and stuff, making a very tangible reward back to them to try and make sure they realised that they were valued. But it is a tension because a lot of these environmental projects, they're covering information that is still needed, but maybe would previously have been done through sort of funded people right on the ground. It's a tricky thing.
So thinking a bit more kind of practically, you talked about the tools and the supports that have been developed in COBWEB. If an organisation says, well, we would like to do some sort of like data collection, crowd data collection, how would they go about it? Are there tools there? Are there like this information there to help them how to set it up? Is it something you can go and do starting from not having experience?
I think you can. There's lots of resources available. I think probably before that point, asking lots of kind of questions about why you're doing it will be quite important to make sure that is the right approach to take. And then in terms of how you go about thinking about what tool you're going to use, for instance, it's probably going to involve quite a lot of piloting stuff and trying stuff out. So I mentioned Field Trip, that's a free app, you can try stuff out with that, even if you then want to go and do it with something else in reality. COBWEB will be available, that'll be about a couple of years down the line I think, so another year probably until there's anything to go and play with. But actually things like wikis can be quite useful for getting just an initial kind of go at gathering some data together, sort of identifying your audience. I think the tricky bit is you need to work out what it is you actually want to collect, what kind of format it's going to be in, if there's a tool that already does that, and if you go and have a look through things like the reporter mentioned, if you go and have a look at sort of other sites and other citizen science projects and see what they're using. So, I've mentioned Zoomverse a few times, they have like 18 or 19 projects I think now. They're using effectively the same tool, they're using it in different ways. So there are kind of people that you can go and approach as well. So you can approach them, you can approach UCL's done a whole bunch of crowdsourcing projects, you can approach people like us. So I'd say the first step is to go and speak to those other people anyway, because there'll be able to be some kind of feedback on what's realistic, what's not realistic. But I think the bit that's probably at least as important as any of the technology is working out who the hell your audience is. Do they actually want to take part? Are they tech savvy? Are they using a particular tool already? There are crowdsourcing projects that just use Flickr pictures and a particular tag or a particular group. That can work as long as you know your audience are going to also be on Flickr. There are Twitter projects the same. The UK Sound Map was an example of that, where the British Library picked up lots of different sound recordings using the same hashtag. That works as long as you know you've got an audience there. So I think getting to know your audience and how big it's going to be and how many you need to be actively contributing it to some extent before you actually have a useful set of data. I think getting a handle on that will then lead you to the right kind of set of tools. And I think that's probably the right way around to kind of think about it. Just you can't go and ask someone what kind of tools you want to use, but you can go and ask them what they're already using or what they're already familiar with. So our project has an interesting challenge. Our project is in rural areas where there is not very good internet reception, not on phones, and not very good internet connections in homes. So one of the requirements of COBWEB is that it works offline. That's quite an important requirement. That's also quite different from quite a lot of tools. If you know that your participants are all not online at all, then crowdsourcing might have to be in a very different format, and it might still be fine to do it that way. So I think just kind of getting a handle on what's going to make sense to that audience, where you can bring them along with you a bit, but what it's going to take to move them along to a place where they can actually contribute and feel motivated to contribute more than once, because the more contributions they make, the kind of better return you're getting on any kind of publicity you're doing, any support you're doing, any sort of local work or workshops, whatever you're doing. So I think if you can get a handle on that, then you go and speak to other people who've been running these projects already, or have a look at the tools that are available already. Sometimes the low-tech approach works quite well. There's in terms of the other people who run kind of crowdsourcing projects, there's also a team down in Bristol actually did the complementary science that again have got some experience of doing stuff in environmental science, batch tracking, things like that. So there's not a shortage of people running these kinds of projects. But I think before you get to the point of saying, how do I tech this up, you have to kind of step back and go, is this actually going to be a cheaper, more effective way? Or is my main goal to communicate what it is we're doing, or to get people used to trying something out? So a lot of the Opal projects have been about getting school kids to understand scientific methods. The data they collect is not the higher priority, So what is the higher priority there? And then where's your audience? Where are they going to hang out? Are they going to participate? Do you have a group of them that you can kind of bring with you from the outset to help you design the tools? I think that's certainly been helpful for us to have a group of people from, not quite the outset, but sort of early on into the project, telling us that's not going to work, that is going to work, this kind of device isn't going to work, because that's the other thing once you get into the kind of building stage, you have to go, well, okay, is this Android, or is this iOS, or is this something else? There's a whole bunch of other kind of technical questions, so the more you can get those kind of fundamental, is this worth doing, who's going to participate? Once you know that, and you've got some feedback from them, then you can actually go in a lot better enabled with information to make those choices.
Okay. Have you found kind of unexpected advantages or drawbacks and difficulties that didn't really go in any particular cases, or ones you've done or ones you've seen?
I'd say the advantages from our project and from other ones as well is that sense of building up a network of enthusiasts. That's infectious. So when you start working on a project and lots of other people around you are super enthused about it, that's brilliant. Like, it's you really motivated as well as them, and that's lovely. I think there are also some quite unexpected things sometimes that you find, some quirky little things. So that's fantastic. On a kind of very practical basis, the scale can be a huge advantage. If you can get enough people participating, and it's that if that's the kind of big disadvantage. It's hugely risky. So in terms of how much money you might sink into a crowdsourcing project, the risk of people not participating is your main issue. I think people worry a lot about, is the data going to be good enough quality? Will I get penis pictures? What will I get that's not okay? And actually the big issue is probably going to be what happens when you get 3 responses. So I've been involved in a sort of small-scale crowdsourcing project before now, which, that did not get hundreds and hundreds of responses. We didn't engage the community at the right stage, and in terms of where the release of what we wanted to make available happened versus when the funding ran out, it wasn't balanced in the right way. That's good, we've learned from that, and that was a very small-scale thing in terms of the project itself, but I think that is also a sort of interesting criteria, that sort of thing of you need to get whatever you're doing out the door early enough that you've got the time to support and refine and learn from the data and maybe fix some things and engage the community more if there's a risk of them not participating enough. So I think finding that audience, communication with the audience the whole way through helps deal with that risk, but it's still a risk, and that's part of the reason I think you've got a couple of organisations that have a very big presence in crowdsourcing and citizen science. Wikipedia is the big crowdsourcing one, but there's lots of them are quite big names. That comes back because once they get a bit of press coverage and a bit of traction, then they have a big group of users, and if those people are able to take part in other projects, then they can email them all out. Never underestimate the value of a very boring email list. So you can build up a community, and that means you have more potential participants, and that means you're more capable of getting press coverage and interest and that sort of thing. That makes the biggest difference, I think, in terms of the disadvantages. It's much more about risk of not participating than anything else. But there is also the risk of, is this data usable? People get quite precious about crowdsourced data and quite snobby about their researcher data and which they think is trustworthy. So I think thinking about the quality that you need at the outset and making sure that the process you've put in place is appropriate to what you need, that's also quite important for dealing with that risk. You don't want to spend a lot of money, get lots of people enthused and get lots of data gathered and feel like you can't rely on that data for anything useful, because that then hasn't saved anything. If you're going out and verifying everything by hand, that probably isn't a good sign either. Even some reasonably big projects have had kind of manual verification of images and stuff in some cases, and you sort of think, that's not very sustainable, So the ones that have done really well tend to be the ones where they can handle that scale, and they can also attract people to take part in it, rather than having to rely on sort of very manual checking to make sure the data is absolutely the quality they want. Maybe sampling it, but not checking every data point.
So something that's come up is the kind of balance between public engagement and actually doing real science. is that something that is well understood? Do you think when you look at the totality of citizen science participatory programs, are they more about good science, or are they actually more about public engagement and maybe some sort of political lobbying agenda or something like that?
Oh, there's some of all of it. It depends on the project. So some of them, the astronomy ones, they're pretty good science, that's pretty solid, but that's a community that already, like environmental science, the amateur community is already quite engaged and quite well qualified and does a lot of stuff already with the research community. I don't think I've seen anything that's sort of quite so collaborative looking in, say, a kind of, you're not going to get a pharmacology project of that ilk, because that's a different kind of dynamic in that field. There's a bit of politics to it, definitely. It's definitely good to be seen to be engaging with your citizens or your participants, or whatever. Quite a lot of them are. Science communication, I think that's no bad thing, because doing is often a much more effective and nicer way of learning than just of listening to somebody tell you what it is to be a scientist of this ilk or what it is to witness something. I think how good quality the data is and sort of good science being behind particular projects, I think that is increasingly the case for kind of large scale projects. So COBWEB's funded by the European Union. They have a whole suite of citizens observatory projects, of which we're one. They have another round of funding coming up, so same thing again. I think for that work to be justifiable at that scale and at that cost, there has to be good science behind it, but there has to also be public engagement, and there has to also be kind of political value to doing that. So citizen empowerment is a really important part of those projects. But you get crowdsourcing projects that are, 3 people doing a tool for fun, and those are definitely, that's not about any of those things. That's purely about sort of being very pragmatic and just wanting the data you need at that moment. So I think, I'm not sure that there is a kind of necessarily trend. I think the large scale ones, there has to be a degree of good science in there. But I also think, the public engagement side of it is common across a lot of the more successful projects. Because that's really motivating. If you learn something that is motivating, the rise of MOOCs and sort of open learning in general, I think sort of fits into that same category. People want to find out something new, they want to learn something. So keeping people motivated in that way is much more effective than paying them by the word or something. So I'm not sure there's a trend, but you see all of those factors coming in different ways, and I think it depends what an organisation needs really. There's some lovely small scale kind of crowdsourcing, citizen engagement kind of projects that are much more about public engagement and much more about real buy-in from a community, and I think those are still really, really valuable. But the data is maybe not the valuable bit. The data about how they respond to that or what they've learned and the evaluation of that may be very useful. But the data they produce from what they're contributing isn't always going to be the
It's actually a multi-layered process.
Yeah.
Of thinking about the data, thinking about the place you are and trying to change what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, for our projects, I think the data itself is pretty important, and that's where there's a lot of quality assurance and authentication stuff going on. But having said that, our co-design projects include a few that I think the learning is at least as important as any data it produces. I think one of the nice advantages in general is that kind of cross-collaboration between groups who don't always talk to each other. So for us, it's sort of, the school is working with the RSPB, and the RSPB is getting to hang out with some Welsh Government people and with some people from Edinburgh they never would have hung out with otherwise, and that's lovely. And some of those people know each other and some of them don't, and that's kind of a nice perk, regardless of whatever is produced in those individual projects and whether it's useful to each other. And you see that a lot with kind of serendipitous connections happening.
Yes, that's very interesting, because once you're opening up this process and you never know who is actually going to be joining in the process. And
you never know who's got an interest, especially in sciences. You don't know without asking who's interested in sciences, because a lot of people will do, like I did, science courses up to A level. And then they may go on to university and do them and may not, but they certainly may not work in them as their day job. But their interests might still be sitting there kind of lurking, and I think there can be a perception that the public aren't necessarily interested in all kinds of areas of science, medicine maybe, but not everything else. And actually once you start kind of putting a project out there, you start getting this really lovely kind of Yeah, serendipitous connections with other communities and people who have a shared interest. I know for the Zoomverse community is very, very mature. They have a lot of people who have gone from being participants to being kind of moderators on their boards, to being sort of cheerleaders for the project, to having their own separate communities that meet up. You know, Wikipedia has kind of hackathons and meetups around the place, and there's a lot of kind of new and interesting stuff that gets generated there, and sometimes sort of spin out crowdsourcing projects that happen when that happens. So as long as you get a kind of big, long-lasting community, you can get all kinds of weird, interesting kind of side things come off it as well. But that is one of the things I know in terms of some of the questions that when you're planning this kind of project, I think when you think about the risk of people not participating, there's also a risk that they all kind of go wild for it, but you've only got funding for 3 years or something. I think that's an interesting, when you're starting out a project, working out what the kind of exit strategy is. Can you hand it back to the community, or can you, where you're going to find your follow-on funding from? Because I don't think it's necessarily given that if you've got a big active community, you'll automatically continue to get funding for it, you know. So I think that's also a kind of an odd little thing one needs to plan before you think about it.
Interesting. So finally, if someone is a commissioner of research or needs to do this, finds they're wanting to engage more with the community, and someone offers them crowdsourcing or as a potential solution, what should they be looking out for?
I think, as mentioned before, checking who the audience is, what you actually want to achieve in the project, that's pretty important. And working out if that's actually going to be viable, because you might find that there is not a big enough audience to do this with, or there's a big enough audience and it's the right kind of thing, but there's not enough time to do it. For instance, it takes time. I think you should be looking for ways in which you're going to be building up a long-term kind of network of contacts. The thing that I was most involved with in COBWEB, in fact, was still doing communications type stuff, trying to build up a bit of a community. It is boring stuff like mailing lists. It's also kind of going out there in person sometimes. It's remembering that if you're doing something online, you don't only promote it online, you do it offline as well. So I think in addition to those kind of considerations of what your goals are and who your audience is, and is this the right tool for what you want to do, sort of starting out with kind of what is the change in relationship you want to have with that audience, perhaps. What kind of expertise you have around you, you know, is this something that you're able to do? Is this something you're going to have to partner with another organisation to do? What's it going to cost? And then really look at your costings and make sure they're actually realistic, because there will be lots of need to do lots of outreach, and that's expensive. I don't think there's any kind of successful crowdsourcing project that's not had a lot of legwork involved in terms of speaking to people, getting out there, explaining what to be done. I know some projects do some training of volunteers, and that's one of the ways that they motivate them, attract them early, and get a different set of types of funding as well. So there's a project called Historic Graves in Ireland, and they did a sort of, here's how you use a digital camera, here's how you create metadata, here's how you create a record of what's in this, on this gravestone, which is what they were capturing. And that kind of training got them a certain set of money because they were empowering lots of communities, so very different source of funding. And also enabled them to build up a really interested, really keen network of people. So they had a real backbone of contributors who could then go on and train other people. And I think thinking about that network of how are people going to participate, how are they going to get other people to participate, how is this going to grow and be supported, and what's the structure for that, I think that's certainly a thing you should be thinking of. Even at the outset, even if the stuff that you're kind of thinking about doesn't come to pass, you should at least think about it and ask those questions. I do think that fundamental thing though is this actually the right approach? That's probably the most important. There is a lovely so to do the report they did for UKUF, there's a whole set of questions that were asked of different crowdsourcing projects about what their goals were, about what their intentions were, about how they plan their activities. And I would say that's actually quite a good plan to go through, like list of questions to go through when you're trying to plan an activity and see if this is right or not. Like just being able to answer the questions probably says something about how prepared you are to do it. But yeah, thinking about the kind of exit as well, I think is also quite important. Like how are you going to fail gracefully, or how are you going to sort of succeed gracefully? Because you can succeed poorly as well. And sort of trekking around, having a look at see what else is out there as well, because it might be that you're better off adding some new data capture to an existing experiment, an existing group of people, than you are to try and start something wholly new. It's very hard to build a community up from scratch. It's much easier to tap into existing communities. That's part of the reason stuff like kind of co-design and pilots and stuff make a big difference, but it's also the case that you've got a whole bunch of people who are really enthusiastic and love doing crowdsourcing projects, and you can find discussion boards for them, sharing resources and things. So sort of targeting those a little bit, or finding out who the kind of opinion makers are in those communities, and if they think this is a good idea, that can be really helpful. That's a contact I made on the project that went not as well, not badly, but not as well, I mentioned earlier. That contact has been continuously a really, really good contact on the kind of area we were working on there, which was around sort of family history and local history and genealogy. And although that project hasn't gone quite how I want it to be, the kind of contact and network made during it has been really useful for lots of other things. And the feedback from the kind of people we met in the communities there made all the difference anyway, in terms of our understanding of what we'd done well and what we'd done less well. So I think the people are really quite important. If you're talking about something that needs to be superly science rigorous kind of stuff, then I also think kind of considering what is going to be acceptable to your researchers is really important, and we had some really interesting conversations about that in COBWEB, sort of saying, well, what is going to be useful data, and what do we do to make sure that the data you have is useful in the way that you need it to be. And that's part of the reason why kind of having an indication of what the quality is important for that project, you know, rather than saying this is trusted or this is not trusted. It's much more, this is trusted to this degree, you know. But again, if you're then trying to work out which system to work with or what you're going to build yourself, having an idea of what's needed at the other end, what you want to do with that output, that's going to make a big difference to how you design those things, or who you commission to build it, or who you work with to deliver it. So yeah, I think take advantage of the resources that are already out there as a starting point, and ask yourself lots of difficult questions, because someone else will if you don't, you know, and probably rather later in the project. I mean, I'd also have to think about who you want to fund it, because they will have different priorities. So, you know, the EU will probably want it to be about empowering citizens in general, and that's certainly what the last kind of few calls have been about. Your research councils may well want it to be about doing data at scale. That's been a real focus for them in the last years, I would say. If you're looking at sort of international funders, they might have a whole different set of kind of a mixture of those kinds of criterias. In some cases, funders will want that to be super openly available. That might be another kind of reason to do it in a different type of way. So I'd certainly also look at that, sort of thinking quite practically about what can I do, and who's going to pay for it, and how long is it going to run for, what scale can it work at. Yeah.
It's been very interesting. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, thank you.
Right.